On July the 1st of 2020, Maria Bucci left her workplace in Brisbane, Australia, and spotted her ex-boyfriend hiding behind a pillar next to her vehicle. Former Government House security guard Cameron Turgay Bardak was armed with a hatchet, and he told the woman to get in the car, threatening to kill her. She started screaming as Bardak pushed her against a wall. David Sturgis, a man riding by on an electric scooter, rushed to the woman's aid and sustained a cut to his hand as Bardak swung the hatchet at him. Bardak then turned his attention back to Bucci and struck her with the bladed weapon, causing her to collapse. The enraged ex hit her again as she was covering her head with her hands. Sturgis charged him again and managed to wrestle the hatchet away from Bardak, at which point the man started strangling Bucci. Sturgis punched him in the back of his head and in the kidneys, but the strikes didn't deter him. Several workers from nearby offices rushed to his aid and were able to loosen Bardak's grip, allowing the woman to flee. Bardak went after her again and tried to strangle her, but was ultimately pinned down by several men until law enforcement arrived at the scene. Bucci recovered after having sustained lacerations to her hand and finger from the hatchet strikes, in addition to injuries to her throat and having a clump of hair ripped out of her head. In the aftermath, Bardak tried to plead guilty to the lesser charge of causing grievous bodily harm, claiming he'd brought the hatchet as a coercive measure towards getting his ex to talk to him. A judge denied his plea and he was ultimately convicted of attempted murder. He was given 14 years behind bars in addition to 3 years for wounding Sturgis, with the sentences meant to run concurrently. After the sentence was delivered in early May of 2023, Bucci spoke to the media and described those who'd intervened to stop Bardak as heroes, thanking them for saving her life. Number 6. Aaron Condor. British woman Sarah Wetham met Aaron Condor while on a night out with friends in August of 2016, and 2 months later the Manchester couple moved in together. Wetham thought that Condor was a real gent, but he gradually grew possessive and controlling in the relationship. In 2018, Wetham gave up her job as an administrator to care for her father, who'd been diagnosed with a terminal breathing disease the previous year. Condor reportedly started to resent Wetham for choosing to spend time with her father and didn't like her going anywhere without him. In one jealousy-fueled row, he grabbed her by the hair, which the woman would look back upon as a first sign that she should have ended the relationship. In February of 2018, Condor, who had 2 children from a previous relationship, subjected his partner to an abusive verbal tirade that reportedly included referring to himself as an alpha male and calling her barren for not having any children. Condor had reportedly been on a 3-day alcohol, cannabis, and cocaine bender at the time. Wetham would later state that she knew the relationship was over at that point. She went to sleep in a different room and remained fully clothed under her dressing gown in case she needed to leave the home quickly. She'd been asleep for less than 15 minutes when she awoke to Condor raining down strikes on her back and head. He was reportedly screaming about a WhatsApp message that Wetham had sent about her boyfriend when it was actually a message she'd received from one of her friends about her own boyfriend. Wetham struggled to explain throughout Condor's onslaught. She initially thought the man was punching her, but then felt liquid soaking up her gown and came to the harrowing realization that he'd been stabbing her. Condor had struck his ex with a machete so hard that the blade had come off the handle. She was found by neighbors who called the emergency services. The woman had suffered multiple severe injuries, including deep slashes that left muscles exposed in her head, back and shoulders. In addition to severed tendons in her hands and multiple finger fractures, she also had a skull fracture that required emergency surgery for the removal of bone fragments. Wetham and Condor ended up on the same ward, and even though the latter was surrounded by police officers, the woman was still fearful for her life. So she remained silent so that he wouldn't realize she was there. They both survived, and Condor was charged with attempted murder. He pleaded guilty to the lesser charges of wounding with intent and was jailed for 12 years and 8 months. Number 5. Marie Thompson. On July the 26th of 2017, British woman Marie Thompson talked to her ex-boyfriend and arranged to go to his Newcastle house for a drink. While the unnamed man was in the bathroom, 2 robbers entered the home, and when the man came downstairs, the duo attacked him. They stabbed him in the leg and stomach and threatened to kill him if he didn't cooperate and tell them where his valuables were. The robbers seemed to have an intimate knowledge of the homeowner's possessions, as they were aware of a gold chain he'd previously owned. Thompson stood by and watched as they knifed and beat her ex. The duo hogtied the victim and then doused him in alcohol, threatening to light him on fire, but ultimately couldn't get a lighter to work. Before leaving with the man's jewelry, wallet, and PIN number, the men claimed that they were going to kidnap Thompson. The victim was able to break free and summon help, with the police subsequently finding him unconscious in a pool of blood. He survived after receiving surgery and over 60 stitches, but struggled with the long-term consequences of his ordeal that also involved him developing PTSD. In the violent robbery's aftermath, it would emerge that it had been orchestrated by Thompson. Messages that she'd sent a friend prior to the attack indicated that she hoped there was still something for them to steal from her ex. Referring to her accomplices, she'd written, "I dread to think what they're going to do to him," but also added that the man deserved what was coming to him. It was Thompson who'd unlocked her ex's door and led the robbers inside. One of them was reported as being her new boyfriend. 46-year-old Thompson ultimately admitted conspiracy to rob and was jailed for 8 years. The woman added that she hadn't imagined her accomplices would take it that far. Number 4. Rashad Green. 30-year-old Rashad Green and his 28-year-old ex-girlfriend were at the Summit County courtroom in Ohio in January of 2014. The woman was seeking a protection order against Green, whom she claimed had threatened and abused her on January the 16th. At some point during the hearing, Magistrate Tracy Stoner briefly left the courtroom. Surveillance footage showed Green getting increasingly agitated and yelling at his ex. He then charged the woman. Green's grandmother, who was also present during the hearing, tried to get between them, but Green pushed her aside. He then slammed into his ex, knocked her down, and started punching her. Stoner re-entered the room and called for a deputy. The lawman subdued Green with a stun gun and then handcuffed him. His ex was reported to have been left with a head injury in the assault, but it wasn't deemed life-threatening. Green was subsequently charged with domestic violence and booked into the county jail, while his ex was granted a temporary restraining order. The court's community outreach director subsequently told the media that the incident marked the first time that someone had been attacked in the courtroom. They argued there was a high probability that Green would have charged the woman even with the magistrate present. The director added that the institution would be re-examining its policies and funding to prevent similar incidents from happening in the future. Number 3. Laney Minotti. In the summer of 2017, a Maine woman was arrested on multiple charges after she'd caused havoc at her ex's home. 23-year-old Laney Minotti entered the unnamed man's Portsmouth residence without permission and found him having intimate relations with another woman. The ex-boyfriend escorted Minotti out of the home and locked the door behind her. In the moments that followed, she forced the door open and attacked him and his lover, inflicting scratches to both of them. Minotti had fled by the time that law enforcement arrived at the address, and a warrant was put out for her arrest. She was taken into custody in late July on charges of burglary, trespass, simple assault, and domestic violence simple assault. Minotti was subsequently released on a $2,000 personal recognizance bond while awaiting a trial date. Number 2. Chloe James. In September of 2020, 2 years following her breakup with Chloe Coelho, 27-year-old Welsh woman Chloe James asked her to meet at an isolated rural spot near Llangennych in Carmarthenshire. James claimed that she wanted to exchange personal items and go on a walk with their dog, Ted, one last time. 21-year-old Coelho agreed, but after the walk, James asked to go for a drive, told her ex that she loved her and tried to kiss her. Coelho pushed her ex away and reaffirmed their separation. It was then that James claimed she had a surprise in her car but was embarrassed to give it to Coelho and asked the young woman to close her eyes. Seconds later, Coelho felt a searing pain in her head and dropped to the ground. She saw that James had a claw hammer in hand and reportedly heard the woman saying, "If I can't have you, no one else will." Covered in blood, after having been struck multiple times, Coelho stumbled towards the headlights of an oncoming car, and the couple inside stopped and helped her. She was taken to Prince Philip Hospital in Llanelli and treated for bruising and lacerations to her ears and scalp. Fortunately, she hadn't suffered any damage to her skull. Following the attack, Coelho remembered that James had made a comment years prior when they were watching the Netflix show You. The main character, Joe Goldberg, is a serial killer, played by actor Penn Badgley. At one point, he becomes obsessed with aspiring writer Guinevere Beck and attacks her partner with a hammer. While watching the scene, James reportedly told Coelho, "If you ever finish with me, I'll turn into him." In hindsight, Coelho realized that her ex had been chillingly truthful in her statement. James was arrested the day after the attack and maintained that she'd acted in self-defense before pleading guilty to assault occasioning actual bodily harm on the day she was due to stand trial. She was sentenced to 22 months in prison, suspended for 18 months in order to complete a rehabilitation course, in addition to paying her victim about $1,000 in compensation. Coelho, who'd been left with recurring headaches and flashbacks of the attack, called the suspended sentence an absolute joke, adding that she felt like she had been assaulted all over again. We have our earlier release on When Bad Friends Go Wrong lined up for you after number 1, in case you haven't seen that one yet. Stay tuned if you'd like. Number 1. Amanda, Diane, Kristen. In the fall of 2022, a married couple were at an Eastside H-E-B in San Antonio, Texas. The woman went inside to buy some groceries while the man remained in the car with their child. As he waited, a woman walked up to his vehicle and began causing problems, so he drove across the street to avoid her. She would later be identified as 34-year-old Amanda Diane Kristen, an ex-girlfriend whom the man hadn't seen in over a decade. Upon returning to pick up his wife from the store, Kristen attacked them both. As the woman walked up to the car, she struck her in the face with a metal bar, causing her to collapse. Kristen then brandished a screwdriver and tried to stab the man in the neck, but he avoided the strike and was stabbed in the chin instead. The couple, neither of whom had suffered life-threatening injuries, left the parking lot and called the police. Kristen, whose motives for the attack remained unclear, was subsequently arrested on 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon, and her bond was set at $105,000. Number 7. Keegan Barnes. During the pandemic lockdown on June the 10th of 2021, friends Keegan Barnes and Tony Butler were drinking at the former's home in the town of Thornaby, England. An unspecified argument erupted between the two women, both in their 20s, reportedly related to illegal substances which they'd also been taking at the time. According to Barnes, Butler had dragged her out of bed by her hair while carrying a kitchen knife. The latter allegedly threw her on the floor but dropped the knife as she punched and kicked her. Barnes grabbed the blade and stabbed her friend twice in the calf. One of the knife strikes severed a main vein, and as Butler was bleeding out, Barnes left the apartment. CCTV captured her buying chips at a local convenience store with her friend's credit card, and while only wearing her nightie. Butler passed away from her injuries, and the investigation that followed gradually dismantled Barnes's self-defense claim and indicated that she'd been the main aggressor in the fight. Moreover, the police determined that her concern had been to primarily conceal her actions rather than render assistance to her friend. She pleaded not guilty to murder and was ultimately cleared of it, but a jury did find her guilty of manslaughter. In 2022, she was sentenced to over 8 years in prison. Number 6. Taylor Smith. 18-year-old Taylor Smith was with her friend Jordan Holgerson, also in her late teens, at Washington's Molten Falls Bridge on August 7th of 2018. In a clip that since went viral, Holgerson was standing on the edge of the bridge and hesitating to jump into the water below. Others in her group were recorded telling the teen that she didn't have to do it, but Smith kept taunting her. "No, I won't go in," Holgerson told the group. Moments before Smith forcefully pushed her from behind. Holgerson's limbs flayed through the air as she dropped roughly 60 feet and impacted the water face first at an awkward angle. Medical experts later determined that given the distance of her fall, the water would have been akin to concrete. Holgerson was left with life-threatening injuries that included 6 broken ribs, an injured trachea and esophagus, in addition to punctured lungs. She experienced severe breathing difficulties upon being pulled from the water and remembered thinking she was going to die. It would take months for her to fully heal from the injuries. Holgerson's mother later argued that Smith hadn't checked on her daughter, neither at the scene of the incident nor in the period that followed, and only apologized via text. Many of those commenting on the viral clip argued that Smith should be held criminally responsible. She was arrested and charged with reckless endangerment, to which she pleaded guilty in 2019. It resulted in a sentence of 2 days in jail and 38 days on a work crew. She was also ordered to pay Holgerson $300 and cease all communication with her for 2 years. Number 5. Mustafa Magdi's engagement party. An engagement party in the Alexandria Governorate of Egypt ended in tragedy on May the 25th of 2022 after the groom-to-be was fatally shot. The victim, identified as 21-year-old barber Mustafa Magdi, was being held aloft and carried by his friends to the celebrations. Much like with other Middle Eastern countries, special occasions in Egypt are also sometimes marked with celebratory gunfire. In the context of weddings and engagements, it may be interpreted as a show of force, highlighting the union of two families. There have been a number of fatal incidents related to the practice across the Middle East, but also in the US, Europe, and South America, in which people were struck by falling or stray bullets. Magdi's friends carried him on their shoulders as they headed to a beauty salon, where his bride was having her makeup done. The plan was to wait for the woman and then head to the party's venue together, but following a rattle of gunfire, Magdi collapsed to the ground. He was left in critical condition after being hit by a bullet and passed away shortly thereafter at Mabaret al-Asra Garb Hospital. Other companions confirmed that the shooting had been caused by one of the friends recklessly aiming his weapon during the celebrations, but his identity wasn't disclosed. Number 4. Joshua Davis. Welsh teenagers Joshua Davis and Rebecca Aylward from Aberkenfig near Bridgend had been friends for some years before they briefly dated in 2009. The relationship ended after a few months, but Aylward was reportedly thrilled when Davis contacted her the following October, asking that they meet up again. Her mother was approving of Davis as he was an academically gifted young man who hailed from a church-going family. As recounted by Aylward's mother, the teen woke up early on October the 23rd of 2010 to do her makeup and put on clothes she'd bought the day before in anticipation for the rendezvous. Later on, she and Davis were in secluded woodland. It was there that he attacked Aylward from behind and tried but failed to break her neck. He then grabbed a rugby ball-sized rock from the ground and repeatedly smashed it against Aylward's head, cracking her skull. He abandoned her face down on the wet forest floor where she succumbed to her injuries. In the killing's aftermath, he took a friend, only identified as Boy B, to see Aylward's body and tell him about what he'd done. A search for Aylward was launched when she failed to return home, during the course of which Davis updated his Facebook status to give himself an alibi. Once the teenager's body was found and her whereabouts were retraced, Davis and Boy B were arrested. The former tried to pin the murder on the latter, but his statements were rapidly dismantled by investigators. It emerged that he'd been boasting to friends online for months that he would kill Aylward and contemplated various methods including poisoning, drowning, or throwing her off a cliff. Davis's friends encouraged him, and one of them even joked about buying him breakfast if he followed through on the threats. 2 days before the murder, the friend received a message from Davis that read, "Don't say anything, but you may just owe me a breakfast." He was eventually found guilty of the killing and sentenced to a minimum of 14 years in prison. But the friends who'd nudged him towards making his twisted intention a reality weren't charged. Number 3. Takia Strickland, Armoni Coffer, and Jasmine Donald. In February of 2015, Mariah Pointer and 3 of her best friends were playing a drinking game at a home in Atlanta, Georgia. At some point during the get-together, one of the other women accused 23-year-old Pointer of sitting on her whopper, even though in reality she'd only sat on the wrapper. The trio charged the woman and began ruthlessly beating her as she slipped in and out of consciousness. Pointer was dragged across the room by her hair as Takia Strickland, Armoni Coffer, and Jasmine Donald took turns punching and stomping on her. Others in attendance, who were identified as the attacker's boyfriends, recorded the incident on their cell phones but didn't intervene. One of them was seen in the background of the video as he sat on the couch while holding a small child. The footage was subsequently uploaded to various sites including worldstarhiphop.com, which is known for similarly shocking videos. Pointer claimed that the beatdown lasted for at least 2 hours before the trio ultimately allowed her to call her aunt to come pick her up. Pointer later uploaded photos of her severely swollen face online. The beating left her with facial fractures, a concussion, and 2 cracked teeth. Strickland, Coffer, and Donald were arrested on charges of aggravated battery, aggravated assault, and false imprisonment, which was likely to result in all of them spending time in jail. Number 2. Zachary Woodcock. In January of 2018, Zachary Woodcock was celebrating his 21st birthday. at his Bavarian House Apartments home in Merrill, Michigan. Also joining the festivities was the man's best friend and fellow gun enthusiast, 21-year-old Richard Skillman. During the party, Woodcock led him and a few others to his bedroom to show them a handgun. The firearm went off as Woodcock was handling it, and Skillman was struck in the chest by a bullet. Immediately becoming unresponsive, realizing what he'd done, Woodcock left the apartment and a second gunshot rang out. Skillman died at the scene while Woodcock succumbed to his gunshot wound at a local hospital the following day. The authorities reported that the two men, both of whom had worked as truck drivers, owned multiple firearms, and also remarked upon the ever-present danger of handling such weapons while under the influence of alcohol. Number 1. Anna Bonner. In April of 2022, Englishwoman Anna Bonner, aged 40, was called greedy, devious and manipulative by a judge at Liverpool Crown Court after leading a lengthy fraud campaign against her best friend, Susan Hughes. The two women had met in the late 1990s, and Hughes was even the leading bridesmaid at Bonner's wedding. They'd constantly go out together in Merseyside, and during a night on the town, Hughes started talking to a club bouncer named Stee. The relationship never went beyond that of acquaintances, but Hughes wanted more and was thrilled when Bonner later revealed that the man was her uncle, Stee Lucas. After a few years, Lucas reached out to Hughes out of the blue and arranged a rendezvous in Liverpool, for which he never showed up. The man then claimed that he'd been sent to jail and needed money as he was being harassed by other prisoners. Hughes gave up the cash. In 2015, Hughes learned that Lucas was in the US, where he'd been diagnosed with cancer. Over the course of roughly 5 years, Hughes continued funding what she believed was her love interest's life-saving treatment, ultimately giving up nearly $150,000 of the savings she'd gathered while working as a nurse. Throughout that time, Bonner had been confirming Lucas's reports and fueling her best friend's crush, encouraging her to send letters, cards, and gifts, which were reciprocated by the man. Then in early 2020, she pressured Hughes to transfer more money, claiming she was in the US taking care of Lucas. By that point, Hughes had nothing left and had also worked herself to the point of suffering a breakdown. Bonner's web of lies began to unravel when Hughes and a friend checked the woman's social media and discovered she was in Skelmersdale, not the US. Further investigation revealed Steve Lucas didn't exist, and Bonner's ex-husband told Hughes he'd found a bundle of cards and gifts she'd sent him. Using a middleman and manipulation, Bonner had fabricated Lucas and used Hughes' money to fund her lifestyle. The mother of three eventually pleaded guilty to fraud by false representation and was jailed for 28 months. Thanks for watching. If there was a button that instantly drained all your ex's accounts and transferred them to yours without any consequences, would you press it? Let us know in the comments section below.